Hello, it's James from XRobots.co.uk. This is part 19 of Ultron, the Real Robot. This project is a real robot with real motors and gears and mechanics in it. Have a look back in some of the previous parts to see it moving from a motion capture sensor. Eventually it's going to be partially driven by a motion capture suit and partially by its own AI, also with various sensing and other stuff, so it's going to be quite a social robot. I've only got a few core mechanical parts left to build, then some cosmetics, and after that we can get on with the actual electronics that control it, and I'm hoping to do that within a few more episodes. Today I want to build the forearms and the lower arms and all of that stuff, which I haven't done at all yet or even planned. It's going to be quite a lot of motors normally to move sort of the hand to open and close at least, rotating the wrist and the elbow. But in fact what I want to do out of interest really more than anything else is build a kind of clutch system with perhaps a servo that moves gears, so I can have one drive motor that's the main powerful motor for all of those axes and another smaller motor to switch it around. So we're going to need quite a complicated mechanical assembly for this, but let's have a look at some CAD and some experimentation. In order to get enough gear reduction in a small enough space to make this work, I'm going to need some worm gears. Now normally I use the gears out of the Autodesk 123D design gear library, which I've got on the right here. This is one of the ones I use normally for the motor, which is 8 teeth, and you can also use a rack. But there's no worm gear that's compatible. So I need to somehow make a worm gear that's got the same pitch as these teeth. So what you do get though in the hardware side of this is some bolts, and I've imported some of them here. I could obviously get something off Thingiverse, but it's quite good to be able to custom everything up and make it exactly the right length and so on. So what I decided to do is modify one of these bolts essentially to make it the right pitch to turn it into a worm gear. So I tried scaling down one of those bolts to match. I've got the right pitch there, but obviously the teeth aren't big enough and there's not really any way of modifying them. I can scale this out and make it much wider, but obviously then it ends up too big to serve as a useful worm gear. So instead I chose one of the other gears, which is this screw for sheet metal, which is right at the bottom of the sort of hardware library there, which has got just about the right pitch, although it's a bit sharp. So what I've in fact done is scaled it up a lot, and then I've done a sketch here and I've actually cut the outside off, so I've got these flats now instead of having the pointy tooth, and I can continue to scale that. It seems to fit the pitch okay. And the way I got the pitch right was by measuring one of these, and that tells me that that's 10mm, and then I found a place around here where I could measure the tooth and then just scaled it the right ratio to make sure that's 10mm as well, and that gives me exactly the right pitch to mesh, and hopefully that should mesh with the other gears as well since they're all compatible. So that's my final scaling, which seems to fit. There is a bit of a gap, but obviously the 3D prints will come out slightly bigger with the overhangs printed and all of that, so I think that's going to be about right, and that's a test to fit it with the other gear there, which probably fits as well hopefully. What I really need is a reduction, so I'm going to be driving this worm gear from the motor, but that's actually going to be a gear that moves around, and that design will become apparent shortly. So we need to put a gear on the bottom of the worm gear, and I've put them there, and then I realised that wouldn't print very well due to the overhangs without lots of support material, which would mess up this gear. So in fact I'm not going to do that. I'm going to make them as separate pieces and then put them all on the same shaft and solvent weld them together. So essentially these pieces here, what I'm going to finally print, and then we've got two gears of different sizes so we can test meshing, and a little gear to put on the bottom of here. And this is all going to run on 4mm stainless bar in the same way that my Gonk Droid knees work, so I'll probably make some nylon 3D printed bushings for the axle to run on. Here are the parts. It didn't come out too badly. I probably need to print slower because there are a few issues with the overhangs there, you can see. But it's good enough for a test, and I've solvent welded on that gear on the bottom. So obviously we can see the picture. This is just about right. There's a bit of a gap because these things aren't quite fat enough, so I need to adjust that. But on the whole I think that will work as a worm gear. So the plan is that I'm going to have a gear on this motor and a gear on here, and several worm gears, and this gear is going to come round on a pivot and engage with another one and another one, probably 3 of them for 3 actions: gripping, twisting and the elbow in the arm. So this is getting quite wide though. I can probably knock some off this because it's quite a bit wider than it needs to be, and also there's some wasted space here I can reduce. And also I'd really like to put the motor like this, but obviously the gears don't mesh, so what I probably need is a bigger gear this size on there instead, so this can mesh and it doesn't bind on the worm gear. So we need to make some adjustments and try again, but I think that's going to work out quite well. This is attempt 2, so we've got the shorter worm gear, and because I'm using the bigger gear I can now merge this in and there'll be not too many problems printing that tiny overhang. So that should be fine to print in one piece. I've also pulled all the surfaces out just by highlighting them and doing press and pull face, and I've pulled them out by 0.5 millimeter, so now they should be pretty tight against that gear. You'll notice this screw's quite handy because the faces have an inverse curve on them, so that fits the curve of the gear quite nicely. So if I can make it all the right size, it should work quite well. Here it is. It's actually slightly taller than that because I forgot to merge in the top where I reduced it and shrunk it down. But obviously this is much tighter now. In fact, it seems to fit pretty well, and I'm pretty confident that that is going to turn that gear round, so that looks pretty good to me, and we can move on with the rest of the design. This is basically what I'm trying to achieve. So I've got 3 sets of these worm gears which are all in an arc, and the pivot point is the yellow thing on the top there. The blue part there with the little gear is the motor, so that's going to pivot around the yellow part. So we can just use smart rotate here to attempt to rotate that round. So if we rotate to 45 degrees it should mesh with that side quite nicely. And if we were to do it the other way, of course, we'd engage with the other one. So then we'll have a servo that pushes the motor around. We could have a number of these all around if we had space for different functions. And of course, they're worm gears, so once they've been placed, they won't backdrive because the red gear won't rotate against the worm gear. So it pretty much locks those axes in positions. And then we'll have a control system that means it goes round each one in a round robin, seeing if they need to update, moving the servo to move the motor, and then operating it and moving it to the right position with a pot on some feedback on the actual joint. So I just need to build the actual cradle that pivots the motor around and the servo thing and all the mountings for these, and then we should be ready to go. I've now built this box assembly around it, so we've got somewhere to mount all the drive shafts. So we've got our 3 worm gears running as we had before, with the other spur gears binding against them. I've added in these pulleys, which probably won't be exactly like that, but the plan is the ones on the ends will pull a string basically. I need to mount another pulley with the vertical axis to turn that string on a right angle so it comes out of these holes in the end. So the very end setup here one will pull the elbow, one will pull a cord to close the hand, and the middle one will turn the forearm. We'll look at that in a moment. But the basic plan is that those end pulleys will pull strings out of each end. So if we just put that side back on there, basically this end facing us at the moment is going to be towards the elbow, the other one towards the hand. And I've got these extra mounting holes here to attach the elbow hinge to. Now for rotating the forearm, of course the middle gear is lower because of the way that the thing swings around here. It means that one of those gears is lower. So the plan is that that's going to bind on a kind of curved track, and it's going to pivot against these points here, which are on both ends. So there's going to be essentially a hanging cradle, the radius of which is this radius here, with a sticking up bit that goes in this channel that this gear turns. So when the motor's in the middle position, it basically swings that cradle underneath side to side, and attached to the other end of it is the hand. So essentially that's how it rotates the forearm. And then obviously the strings, as I say, pull out each end for the elbow and closing the hand. The only challenge I've got is, of course, that swinging cradle swinging on this pivot point is going to block up the hole where the strings come through. So I need to give that a bit of a rethink. I think possibly turning some of the gears round so the pulleys face in the right way without another pulley having to be in there to right angle the string in the first place. Alright, here's the next version. So now what I've done is turn these end gears and pulleys so they're in a vertical axis to start with. That also means the pulley is now above the pivot point and there's no hole through the purple parts anymore because it doesn't need to be. So I do need something to actually mount these on, and I've left extra screw holes, you can see them just here, and above and below basically to put a platform. Haven't decided even if that pulley is the right shape yet. But I need a platform to hold that vertical axis. So I've got those both ends, and now those pulleys will pull hopefully right along the centre. They might need to be a slightly larger diameter, but of course the string will come off one side of them, being wrapped around it, so it'll come straight on that center point. So even though the hand is pivoting around, rotating about that point, then that still pulls a string right almost down the middle. It's slightly off center because of course it's above the axis. The same for the other one, which is for the elbow. So if I make the elbow joint really low, then this will pull and close that elbow joint, hopefully. So this thing's got rather bigger, although actually it's not too big considering the size of the gears and the motor in there. And what I'll do is make the elbow joint out of the cosmetic parts, so there'll be some rounded parts that stick on either side of this to make up Ultron's forearm. Unfortunately, he's got quite large forearms, nearly the size of his biceps, so a bit like Popeye, so there's plenty of space to stick the mechanics in. I do still need a servo to rotate this around, and that can be stuck in here somewhere. There's plenty of space now, and pivot at a suitable point so that it can reach both of the gears okay. Hopefully that's going to work out fine. So I'm going to get some of these parts printed at this point. Most of it's ABS. These worm gears, in fact, I'm going to print in Toolman alloy. So I mentioned making bushings for the axles, the same as I did in my Gonk Droid project. But if I just print the whole gear in Toolman alloy and let it rotate freely on the shaft, then it can be its own bearing or bushing, whichever way you look at it. So I need to get those parts printed. I'm going to do one set and an opposite set for the other arm, and hopefully we can get something assembled and tested. Here's the worm gear printing in Toolman alloy. So it's printing on the PEI bed of the Lulzbot Mini, but I have in fact put some Elmer's glue on there. You can also use Yoo-Hoo glue stick to help that stick. You'll notice there's a little bit of warping at the bottom, so I'm probably going to print the subsequent ones with a brim on, but it looks like it's coming out pretty well. Printing at about 50mm a second with no support, and the overhangs are all looking good. These are all the purple parts, which are the cross supports inside. So those are printing on the Lulzbot Taz 6. And I've got the other parts printing just here on a Taz 4/5. This is one of the motor mounts printing on another Lulzbot Mini, and this is in red ABS. Here's the second attempt of that Toolman alloy gear with the brim on, which obviously I'll cut off, but the bottom of that is much flatter, whereas this one you can see, whoops, is not flat at all. I printed this one at a slightly higher temperature as well, at the top of the recommended temperature at 255 degrees, so that may have helped with the warping as well. But this looks incredibly tough. I can't really explain it, but it's going to be excellent for some high power applications. Just getting my first gearbox assembled, so I've got the Toolman alloy worm gear in there and this gear, and that seems to engage okay. So if the worm gear spins, it's rather hard to demo, it does engage, and this one works okay. Obviously I need some spacers in here to hold it in the middle and some other bits and pieces. Similarly, my motor gear that's on this piece that swings backwards and forwards engages perfectly with that gear attached to the worm gear, so that's pretty good. There's hardly any backlash at all. It's pretty tight, but of course the distance is tunable here on this one because the axis is offset, so I can always rotate the motor around in its housing, and I can make this gear be closer or nearer or further away from the bottom. I've now designed these yellow platforms that hold these gears in, so I've got a lump underneath that holds the gear just at the right height, and clearance at the top. The green pulleys need to be properly designed anyway, so they'll probably be slightly taller and obviously printed into that gear so they're all one piece, so I've got some extra headroom there. I need to do some spacers to hold the motor in the right place so it doesn't wobble around, and also hold this gear. So I'm probably going to have a gear with a lump moulded into it, or in fact printed into it on one side, so that the drive shaft goes through it for quite some distance, and then a sort of spacer the other side we can tension up. So that means it won't wobble so much, but it can run freely, and you'll notice that's not perfectly in the middle of the purple parts either, so that's going to need to be quite precise. But nonetheless, we've got most of it designed there, so we can move this motor around and see the different gears running. I've designed out the pulley here, which is the one that pulls the cords to close the hand and the elbow, and I've got an anchor point right through there, which is this hole that goes through the chamfer, and that's got a screw head at the other end there. so that we can anchor the cord. And you'll notice that anchor goes through the chamfer, and then hopefully the actual cord wraps around the smallest part, so then the cord doesn't get caught on the screw head. That's going to be a Toolman alloy part because it's got quite a lot of force around it. I've also designed the other gear with the spacer that sits right in the bottom, and that's going to be an ABS part. So there's also some spacers that help hold that in the middle, and I've done the other spacers of the right length to allow washers as well, which hold the motor and the other worm gears in the middle. So that should be most of the major parts. Starting to get some assembly done now, so I've got my little spacers done here. There's another one at the other end of that worm gear, so now this thing all holds centrally and everything binds properly. I've got the other spacers here ready to go for all of the other gears, and I've also printed some more Toolman alloy gears. That's the pulley gear, so I need to trim the brim off that and we can get on with the rest of the assembly. Right, that's 3 gears installed now, so this meshes on all of them. Probably have to run the motor slowly so that it binds with them okay when it's in motion, but they seem okay at the moment. And I've also got that bottom gear installed, so when this worm gear spins around, we can see that running, and that seems to work pretty well. Okay, I have one all assembled, so we have all of our worm gears in, all of our pulley gears in each end. So obviously this worm gear here, when it turns, will turn this gear on the end, and that will pull up one of the things. The other one turns this one, and obviously the one in the middle turns the bottom gear. So let's put some power on that motor and try switching it across and see that it all works. So that's in the middle position, and as you can see it's turning that gear quite nicely. If I switch it over to this end, it binds on that worm gear, causes this pulley to turn. I may need to make bigger pulleys in there to pull faster because that's going pretty slow, but obviously there's quite a lot of torque on it. And if I switch it over to the other position, just turn that round and put it in the right place, obviously it runs and turns that gear. And all of these gears at the top are Toolman alloy, so they're pretty tough, so there should be no problem with those pulleys pulling the force that they need to pull. The one at the bottom, of course, rotates pretty slow, and that in turn rotates across a toothed track that's going to tip this entire thing, I think. So that's something I need to look at next. So yes, I've actually been making 2 as I go. I've got most of the parts here for the other side, and I've made sure, in fact, that it's a perfect opposite, which is good, which is something I normally forget. So I'm just printing the last few Toolman alloy lead screws. The pulleys at the end, I've decided actually not to print those for the other one yet, until I've put this one on and worked out if they pull up at the right rate. So maybe the hand and the elbow get pulled at different rates with different amounts of torque, in which case those pulleys will have to be different sizes. So I'll test one arm before I print them, but apart from that, all the pieces are here ready for assembly. So obviously this is the forearm that goes down here. It looks a bit chunky at the moment. There's still some cosmetics to go on the bicep here, not to mention the massive shoulder bells that Ultron has. So hopefully once that's done, it will be perfectly in scale. There's still some cosmetic parts to go on each side that are kind of rounded, and obviously the hand and the elbow joint, which will be slightly sort of smaller than this as the wrist comes out. So hopefully that's a bit like a muscly forearm. It is a bit Popeye, but there we go. So next time I'm going to be looking at fitting this onto the elbow hinge, and I think what's going to happen is the elbow hinge is fixed to this rotational part, and then we've got that attached to the axis at each end of this. So this whole thing is driven sideways by that gear in the bottom. Then of course the hand can open and close, and the elbow can bend so it can move all around. I do need to fit a servo to move that motor back and forth, but it doesn't need to move terribly far. It's about that far. And I left this curved gap in here so that I can put a servo inside the rounded cosmetics on one side. So that's all I'm going to do on this project this time, but don't forget to subscribe for more updates on this project and other projects. And also, if you'd like to help support my projects, all my projects are funded through Patreon, so have a look at patreon.com/XRobots. If you want to become an XRobots superfan, basically, and you can get access to some exclusive rewards, including a regular live broadcast with me, and also all my videos early, so don't forget to check that out. Alright, that's all for now.